Délégués, veuillez prendre vos places. Veuillez vous asseoir, nous allons poursuivre les travaux. Honorables délégués, nous vous invitons à rejoindre vos sièges. Nous allons poursuivre les travaux. Vous savez que nous sommes déjà légèrement en retard. Donc, nous allons faire en sorte qu'on puisse gagner sur le temps. Ceci dit, nous avions suivi ce matin déjà avec grand intérêt les présentations des 3 groupes spéciaux sur leurs principales conclusions. Nous avions eu suffisamment d'informations. Nous allons poursuivre maintenant avec une session de questions et réponses, de clarification, avant que nous n'entamions un débat d'ordre général et de fond sur les rapports qui nous ont été présentés. J'annonce déjà que des discussions spécifiques et substantielles auront également lieu pour chaque élément des points 3B à 3F cet après-midi et demain, si nous avons encore la possibilité. Si les délégués ont des questions spécifiques à soulever sur ces éléments, il serait souhaitable d'attendre que nous les abordions. À présent, je donne la parole pour la session de questions et réponses. La séance est ouverte. Je vois le Burkina qui demande la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Co-président. Le Burkina a la parole, c'est ça?
Oui, Burkina, vous avez la parole.
Merci bien, Monsieur le Co-président. Et bon après-midi à tous. Comme c'est la première fois que notre délégation prend la parole, nous voulons saisir cette opportunité pour remercier le gouvernement du Royaume de Thaïlande et puis le peuple pour l'accueil chaleureux. C'est vrai que le Canada a indiqué que c'était un accueil chaud aussi, mais aussi suffisamment humide. En tout cas, ça fait toujours du plaisir de venir ici sur Bangkok pour des rencontres. Je voulais remercier le secrétariat aux zones pour toutes les facilités, comme d'habitude, mises à notre disposition, l'arrangement et surtout pour le workshop d'hier qui nous a permis de passer en revue certains éléments très importants. J'ai suivi avec attention la présentation donc, des différents groupes. C'est l'occasion pour notre délégation de aussi reconnaître, comme d'habitude, et saluer l'apport inestimable et très important de ces différents groupes qui nous permettent vraiment de disposer d'informations précises, scientifiques. J'ai bien apprécié ce que le groupe scientifique a dit, surtout qu'il tire ça du regretté que dont nous honorons la mémoire aujourd'hui. Les scientifiques nous permettent d'avoir l'information juste, mais ce que nous en faisons après, cela n'est pas forcément de leur ressort. En tout cas, je voulais les remercier pour ça et surtout apprécier la production du document 20 questions, 20 réponses C'est vraiment un document très riche. Moi-même, j'ai eu l'occasion de référer certaines personnes qui m'ont posé des questions à cet ouvrage très très important et qui permet réellement, au-delà des questions, de pouvoir trouver des éléments très importants. Alors, revenons donc aux questions précises par rapport aux différentes présentations. Mes questions vont porter surtout au niveau de l'évaluation scientifique. Et il est relevé encore qu'il y a toujours des incertitudes sur l'émission, notamment du CFC 11, sur quelques aspects qui pourraient donc nous échapper jusqu'à présent. Alors, je voulais savoir, est-ce que selon le groupe scientifique, nous avons fait assez en tant que corps? C'est vrai que bon, nos échanges, il nous appartient en tant que parti d'arriver à des conclusions en nous basant sur des éléments pertinents qu'ils nous donnent comme apport. Mais de leur point de vue, en tant que scientifiques, ils pensent que nous avons fait suffisamment d'efforts. C'est vrai que dans la présentation, ils ont loué les efforts qui sont faits à notre niveau et surtout, si ce n'était pas fait, des éléments naturels qui pourraient aussi contribuer à d'autres méfaits. J'ai bien aimé cet exemple porté sur la Unga Tonga, justement avec ces émissions qui pourraient aussi agrandir le trou de l'ozone. Je voulais savoir, est-ce qu'à leur point de vue, ils pensent qu'on peut estimer aujourd'hui la part de contribution de ces phénomènes naturels, si on peut les qualifier ainsi, dans le maintien ou de la création de ce trou d'ozone par rapport donc à nos activités anthropiques, notamment dans la gestion de nos réfrigérants. Je pense que ça, c'est un élément très très important qui pourrait donc nous aider, mais aussi nous encourager à ce que nous-mêmes nous puissions définitivement maintenir notre part. Alors, il y a aussi la question qui est venue, j'ai bien apprécié le graphe qui a été présenté sur les émissions, la charge radiative et tout ce que cela pourrait donc contribuer aussi à nos connaissances. Je voulais aussi savoir de la part donc, de ce groupe d'évaluation scientifique, qu'est-ce qu'ils pensent de notre état actuel, de nos connaissances dans ce domaine. Est-ce qu'il faut encore pousser loin ou bien est-ce qu'il faut encore d'autres mesures dans l'observation ou en tout cas des données nécessaires à collecter pour pouvoir nous permettre, en ce qui nous concerne, de disposer d'informations précises et surtout de disposer d'outils pour des décisions qui vont nous permettre une mise en œuvre réussie et surtout durable des impacts des activités que nous menons. Encore, merci.
Merci au Burkina. Je vois que le Bénin a sollicité la parole. Je donne la parole au Bénin.
Au nom du Bénin, nous remercions le secrétariat pour l'organisation de cette assise, ainsi que le gouvernement thaïlandais. Nous remercions également les différents groupes des experts qui viennent de nous faire une belle présentation. J'avoue que moi, j'ai beaucoup appris de tout ce qui a été relevé comme recherche ce matin. Et surtout, les différents impacts des rayonnements ultraviolets sur le climat de façon générale. Et j'en ai fait des points pour pouvoir mieux célébrer la journée mondiale de la préservation de la couche d'ozone, dont le thème est restaurer la couche d'ozone et réduire le changement climatique. Donc, de par leur présentation, nous avons assez d'éléments quand même pour avancer au niveau du pays, ce qu'on pourra faire pour marquer cet événement. Dans leur présentation, surtout au niveau des recherches pour la gestion des banques de données, sur les SA obsolètes, ils ont indexé les cimenteries qui pouvaient nous aider pour la gestion de ces substances obsolètes. Ma question, est-ce que ces cimenteries ne vont pas nous opposer d'autres recherches, d'autres analyses avant qu'ils n'acceptent ces réfrigérants obsolètes pour pouvoir nous aider à les gérer. C'est pour savoir s'il n'y aura pas d'autres analyses qu'on doit faire avant qu'on ne leur remette ces SAO pour qu'ils puissent nous aider à les détruire dans leur four. Merci beaucoup, Président.
Merci au Bénin. Je donne la parole à l'Inde. L'Inde, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. As our delegation is taking the floor for the first time, we would like to thank the Government of Thailand for hosting the meeting and the Executive Secretary, Ozone Secretariat, and her entire team for the timely documentation for the meeting. We would like to thank all the panels for their reports, which were very informative, and also the presentation made by each of the panels. Mr. Co-Chair, we do have several clarifications to be sought on the 3 assessment reports. While we would like to seek main clarifications here, we would be making the specific clarifications from each of the panels during the conduct group meetings. So now we would like the clarifications on the following. What will be the impact of the increase of tropospheric chlorine from very short-lived gases, and which are such gases? We would also like to have more clarity on unexplained emissions for CFCs, CTC, and HFC-23, identified as leaks of feedstocks or byproducts, and how such emissions have been identified. It has also been stated that the supply shortages of low GWP alternatives in some sectors are understood to have started during the COVID-19 related supply chain and logistic issues during that period, raw material shortages, manufacturing issues, and at the same time increasing global demand. So we would like to understand how this will have an impact on the implementation of phase-out, phase-down activities. Further, a more rapid phase-down of HFCs than that required by the Kigali Amendment has been proposed here to further limit climate change from HFCs. We would like to know how this would be addressed in terms of challenges faced by parties, especially the low-volume countries and very low-volume countries. It has been said that the global HFC-23 emissions are substantially higher. Can specific information be provided on whether this could be from new fluorinated chemicals that are being produced, and if yes, how can this matter be addressed by the parties? It has also been said that overall increase in ODS feedstock uses in the last decade has been mostly due to the increase in HCFC feedstock uses, particularly HCFC-22, while uptake of HFOs is driving a more recent increase in carbon tetrachloride feedstock use. What would be the views of the panels regarding national processes and frameworks in place for management and monitoring of feedstock uses? We look forward for clarifications from the panel on this. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, honorable délégué de l'Inde. Je vois la Chine qui a sollicité la parole. Chine, vous avez la parole.
谢谢联合主席，这是中国代表团第一次发言，我们也要感谢泰王国政府的热情接待款待，要感谢秘书处组织这个会议，同时也要感谢这个专家组提供的这个基础文件。我们代表团对这个上午的这个报告有以下3个问题想提出来。第一个问题是，我们了解到日泵热水器的出水温度根据不同温区、不同的地理区域需求是不同的。目前 RTOC 报告提到的冷媒替代物主要集中在60度以内的低温日泵。 我们想了解90度高温热泵的替代制冷剂有哪些？这是第一个问题。第二个问题是，降低制冷系统的灌注量也是有效减少 HFC 使用的方法。RTOC 是否能够提供这方面的研究评估信息？第三个问题，我们注意到 MC Talk 在介绍的时候说到了 HFC 在半导体行业作为涉科技，有些国家作为排放用途，有些国家是作为原料用途。那么在实际的使用中 ，HFC 作为涉科技的分解率、回收率是什么样的 ？TIP 对 HFC 作为涉科技的使用用途有什么建议？谢谢。
Merci beaucoup à la Chine. Je donne la parole au Nigeria. Merci.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. As my delegation is taking the floor for the first time, I would like to join other delegations in thanking our host, the Thailand government, for the good hospitality, and also use this opportunity to thank the Ozone Secretariat for organizing this meeting. We wish to thank TIAP for the 2000 Cordonium report. Amongst others, the challenge related to ODS banks arouses our curiosity in the manner that it is presented in the report. In the last paragraph of TIAP report, it stated that parties may wish to consider how relevant international treaty bodies can work together to facilitate transboundary movement of end-of-life ODS HFCs. My delegation requires further clarification on this statement, as it appears to support or encourage the dumping of end-of-life HFC equipment to A5 countries, which is presently a concern to us, noting the ongoing discussion on the illegal dumping of obsolete and inefficient RAG equipment. Thank you.
Merci au Nigeria. À présent, nous allons donner la parole au groupe pour que ce groupe nous apporte des éléments de réponse en attendant que nous ouvrions une seconde liste d'intervention. Les groupes ont la parole pour apporter des éléments de réponse et d'éclaircissement. Merci. Est-ce que les groupes sont prêts pour nous apporter des éléments ou bien on vous donne encore un peu de temps? Oui, allez-y.
Co-chair. Let me first address the question from Burkina Faso. And most specifically, I think the question is have the parties done enough? First of all, I'd like to say that in fact, ozone depleting substances are declining in our atmosphere overall. This is quite an accomplishment, particularly across all the nations of the world. Well, I think scientifically, we have seen ODSs going down. We have seen ozone increasing. The radiative forcing of those ODSs is going down. More specifically, the question is that enough? I believe that's actually a policy question, and we have put some, the one figure I showed that shows some policy options in terms of further controls on, for example, HFCs or very short-lived species could lead to an increased recovery of the ozone layer and a lessening of climate change. One other question that was addressed by Burkina Faso is, do we have to continue monitoring? And I think the answer to that is yes, we do need to continue monitoring. We know, because I mentioned the Hunga-Tonga volcano, that the atmosphere, the Earth provides us with surprises, and we have to be prepared to look at those surprises, find out what they will do to our atmosphere and surface levels of, for example, UV. I speak for my EEAP colleagues there. So we do need to continue monitoring. Ozone is a fundamental gas for our atmosphere, and we have to pay close attention to what happens to it. So my co-chairs, David, would you like to add anything?
I would simply add that I think what Burkina Faso delegate might be referring to is our need for continued vigilance on this topic. That CFC-11 issue is considered a success story, that unexpected emissions were found and then decreased, but as Steve Monska said yesterday, we haven't accounted for all of those emissions. And so from the scientific point of view, we will continue to be vigilant about looking for those emissions and evaluating the budget of those compounds, that compound in particular in the atmosphere. The other Burkina Faso remark was the natural phenomenon of Hunga-Tonga and how does it scale to what refrigerants are doing in the atmosphere. And certainly they're comparable, that as Paul Newman commented this morning, we're anticipating a large change in the Antarctic ozone hole this season due to water vapor from Hunga-Tonga. And on the other hand, even with a large response, it will be short-lived, that the material from Hunga-Tonga will leave the atmosphere within a couple of years, which is very different than, say, CFC-11. So even if the phenomenon have the same response in the atmosphere, the lifetime or the length of time can be very different. Thank you.
There was a second question from Benin. And specifically, I believe the question was on banks of ODSs, and do we need to continue research on that? The answer is yes. We need to have a good understanding of what banks are and the rate at which they're emitted in order to understand atmospheric levels of ODSs. The instruments that are used to make the measurements are very sophisticated instruments. They are measuring, have to be able to measure an ODS. For every trillion molecules, they have to be able to detect one molecule of an ODS. So it is a very precise instrument that we use to make ODS measurements. These are not commercial off-the-shelf instruments. They have to be done by highly technical personnel. And so that, as we've already talked about monitoring, that needs to continue. There was a question from India about the impact of VSLS chlorine. In the scenarios that I showed earlier, there is a bar about controlling VSLS dichloromethane. And in fact, if that is controlled, it would have a very rapid impact because of the short lifetime of dichloro. And in fact, you would get a fairly good reduction of ozone depletion if you controlled VSLS chlorine. So the number is actually in the policy or the executive summary of the assessment. Also, the question about unexplained CTC and HFCs, just to put that in context, we have made great progress in understanding the imbalance between the bottom-up estimates of carbon tetrachloride emissions and the top-down estimates of carbon tetrachloride. There's a fairly large discrepancy in understanding HFCs. And I'll just, to quote the executive summary, in 2019, UNFCCC reports accounted for only 31%, if you include HFC 23 in the analysis, of the global total CO2 equivalent emissions derived from observations. So we do have something of a problem scientifically in matching the bottom-up estimates that the TEEP would provide us to the top-down estimates that we make from atmospheric observations. So any add to that? Thanks, and I think that was all of the questions that were directed to the SAP. Thank you.
Nous allons nous adresser à présent au GETE, au type, s'ils ont des éléments de réponse à nous apporter. Nous remercions déjà le SAP pour les éléments très très importants de précision qui ont été donnés. Merci.
Thank you, Co-Chair. So from the FTAC and from the TEEP for responding to India around the shortages, what we saw was an issue around a mismatch between available capacity or supply of next generation foam blowing agents. It was exacerbated by several events, including the pandemic and some weather events that impacted the operation of several facilities. We have seen some easing of that with new capacity that has recently started up. However, longer term, this kind of a problem could recur if there's not more, if there's not some intervention around it. So I hope that answers the question.
This is the responses on the chemicals questions. Firstly, just to add to the response from the Science Assessment Panel around the unexplained emissions and to concur with the comments that they made, and to just note that in terms of HFC 23, that the TEEP will be providing a report to the MOP in response to 34.7 that might help with the bottom-up estimations of those HFC 23 emissions, and trying to put some of that into perspective. There was another question from India. Oh, and in terms of CTC, you know, we've had improvements there in terms of our understanding, and in the assessment this time around we had some additional information on added to the inventory of the bottom-up emissions, where emissions are likely arising from non-chloromethane production, such as the vinyl chain production process, which was identified as a new potential source of CTC. In response to the question from India about feedstock uses and the question of management and monitoring of feedstock uses, the assessment report and actually the progress report also includes a section on best practices, what's it called? Best practices in controlling emissions of controlled substances that are either products, co-products, intermediates and feedstocks. And we outline in those sections the range of good practice approaches that industry could take to minimising emissions of feedstocks, for example, which includes operating instructions, training, instrumentation, routine sampling, and periodic mass balancing, maintenance procedures. So there's a range of elements that are included in there, and we actually include these in our presentation tomorrow to this meeting on gaps in monitoring, which is the response to decision 34.5, because it's relevant to that decision as well. In response to the questions from China about the semiconductor issue and whether how parties might be treating production and consumption in terms of their reporting under Article 7 and whether that's as an emissive use or a feedstock. We currently don't have a lot of information on, for example, on conversion and recovery rates, as was asked by China, and their impact on emissions, and would certainly welcome any information from parties on those emissions. And the reason we raised the issue in terms of bringing it to parties was this was the first time we'd looked at semiconductor manufacturing as a TEEP, and we were wanting to bring those issues to the notice of the parties for your consideration. So we'll, and you know, we noticed that there was an inconsistency there in the way parties were treating that. So I think that that's an issue for parties. In terms of the question from Nigeria regarding transboundary movement of waste and the concern around dumping and you know, the way we'd phrased that recommendation to parties, which was to consider how the Montreal Protocol could work with other international treaties to facilitate transboundary movement of end-of-life ODS and HFCs. Obviously, it's very important for countries to manage and avoid inappropriate transboundary movements of waste, but we are wanting to bring to the attention of parties the fact that some of the administrative aspects of that system could be a potential barrier to recovery, recycling and environmentally sound destruction of end-of-life ODS and HFCs, which ultimately might, as a barrier, might lead to emissions of ODS and HFCs at end of life rather than environmentally sound management. So the recommendation was for this body and other international treaty bodies to get together, talk about the issues, talk about the various policy objectives, and perhaps try to facilitate and encourage preferential recovery, recycling and environmentally sound destruction. Thank you. Unless my co-chairs and anybody else wants to say anything. Okay, thanks.
Merci beaucoup. Nous remercions les experts pour les éléments de réponse qui ont été apportés. Nous allons à présent ouvrir une seconde liste Mais quand je regarde déjà le tableau qui se trouve devant moi ici, il y a beaucoup de pays qui ont sollicité la parole. Donc je vais dire que c'est la dernière liste parce qu'il y a beaucoup de pays qui voudraient bien intervenir. Je vais donner la parole au Sénégal pour sa question. Merci.
Le Sénégal aussi s'associe à l'ensemble des distingués délégués pour remercier le Royaume de la Thaïlande et remercier le secrétariat aux zones pour la bonne organisation de cette réunion et saluer les 3 groupes d'experts pour le travail de haut niveau. Je m'en vais très rapidement sur une des présentations. Il est question, pour le cas de l'exemple sur les États-Unis, sur un slide de 1890 à 2100, concernant le protocole de Montréal. Peut-être que je me trompe, hein, mais moi, à mon humble avis, le protocole de Montréal a été ratifié en 1987. Moi, ce que je vois plus, c'est 1990-2100, au lieu de 1890-2100. Ça, c'est un point. Une question, c'est que de nombreuses technologies dans les différents secteurs ont été avancées par les 3 groupes, avec potentiel de destruction de l'ozone égal à 0, potentiel de réchauffement global très faible. Mais il y a un paramètre qui n'apparaît pas, c'est sous des températures, sous des climats chauds, c'est-à-dire sur des températures sur des situations de température ambiante élevée. La particularité de nos pays, c'est des pays chauds. Au Sénégal, en été, il y a certaines zones où vous avez 40 jusqu'à 45 degrés à l'ombre. Donc, on aimerait avoir ces nouvelles technologies, leur performance thermodynamique. Et ça, c'est important. Ça peut marcher en Europe, aux États-Unis ou dans les pays du Nord, mais ramener dans nos pays, sous des climats où les températures sont très élevées, est-ce qu'on aura les mêmes performances thermodynamiques? Ça, c'est une question. L'autre élément, l'autre paramètre qui est important, c'est l'efficacité énergétique. Et aussi bien sur le réfrigérant que sur les équipements. Sur le bromure de méthyle, très rapidement, des alternatives existent, ça a été montré. Mais est-ce que ces alternatives sont aussi efficaces dans le traitement des nuisibles, dans le traitement pré-quarantaine et quarantaine? Sur les alternatives concernant les extincteurs, on aimerait avoir plus d'informations. Quelles sont ces technologies, quelles sont ces nouvelles alternatives? Sur la climatisation automobile, la tendance qui domine sous nos pays, les pays Arctique 5, c'est le HFC 134A. Bon, vous avez parlé des HFO, mais actuellement, est-ce que ces technologies sont éprouvées? Parce qu'il y a des risques d'inflammabilité ou autres. Sur les alternatives dans le secteur médical, les utilisations essentielles comme le traitement de l'asthme, vous avez dit qu'il y a des alternatives, mais lesquelles? Ça n'a pas été précisé. Ça n'a pas été précisé. Sur les mouches gonflantes, sur le secteur de la mouche, les agents gonflants, vous avez parlé des hydrocarbures, mais lesquels? Parce que les hydrocarbures, c'est vaste, c'est une grande famille. Il est bon de dire telle famille, par exemple, sur les hydrocarbures. On n'a pas une idée. Je vous remercie. Ce sont ces éléments-là que je voulais porter à l'attention de ces 3 éminents groupes d'experts. Merci beaucoup.
Merci au Sénégal. Je voudrais avant toute chose faire un point. Je veux prier les intervenants à être précis et concis, parce que nous sommes déjà en retard. Donc, si vous pouvez être beaucoup plus clair et précis, ça nous aiderait beaucoup. Nous avons sur la liste ces pays-là, nous avons le Mozambique, le Libéria, la Micronésie, l'Union européenne, les parties, je vais dire, l'Afrique du Sud, la Tunisie, l'Argentine, l'Éthiopie, Koweït, États-Unis, Égypte, Kenya, le Canada, Chili et Cuba. Donc la liste est ainsi arrêtée parce que nous avons beaucoup de pays qui sont sur la liste. Nous ne pouvons pas aller au-delà d'un certain temps. Donc à présent, je vais donner la parole au Mozambique. Le Mozambique, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. First of all, allow me to thank you all the presenters who brought us very important information to our countries. Mozambique requested the floor because we'd like to know the reason of the difference in terms of the UV radiation impact in the human being. And we have seen in the morning, one slide was given some figures. So we see the women is affected by the UV radiations is very high if you compare with the men. So we'd like to know the reason why the radiation, why the melanoma is affecting more women than the men. Because some of, in our countries, like in Mozambique, some of women, they are leaders, family leaders, because they are widow, and some of them never married. So we need to take some information for them, how they must be cared regarding the UV radiation. Thank you very much for the floor.
Merci beaucoup au Mozambique. Micronésie, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Micronesia wants to thank the assessment panels for their valuable work in preparing the quadrennial assessment. It is, as always, a very rich report, and there are many issues of great importance. We wish to ask a few questions regarding 3 issues in particular. The first relates to the issue of the impact of the ozone layer of aerosol injection. As some may recall, this delegation, in addition to several others, raised our concern after the last quadrennial assessment about this issue and subsequently requested that the SAP provide additional information about this novel issue to keep the parties informed about the potential impacts on the ozone layer. We are grateful for the work that impacts the SAP has done to further inform us in the most recent report. We wish to ask the SAP 2 questions. First is a question of timing. How soon after the aerosol injection begin would there be a potential impact on the ozone layer? Second, whether this issue is in fact becoming more of a reality or a possibility. And if so, whether it is a dynamic issue that will require further study and attention in future reports. The second issue is the question of life cycle refrigerant management. In the TEEP section of the report, we learned that, and I quote, quantities potentially available for recovery and management are expected to increase in Article 5 countries. We also learned that, and I quote again, timely efforts to establish and finance end-of-life management capacity to prevent HFC emissions could have a significant impact. First, we would like to ask the TEEP if they can clarify what kind of impact such efforts could have. Is it impacts on the ozone layer, on compliance, on climate change, or other kinds of impact? Second, we would like to ask if the TEEP can clarify what they mean by, and I quote, timely efforts when they say, and I quote again, timely efforts to establish and finance end-of-life management capacity to prevent HFC emissions. Sorry. Third, we wish to ask the TEEP if they have any sense of how much financing could be needed to optimally support proper recovery and reuse of refrigerants, and if they are aware whether any financing is currently available outside of the multilateral fund. And finally, regarding potential recovery and reuse of controlled substances, we would like to ask whether there's adequate information to possible usefulness of these quantities on parties' compliance with the protocol and its Kigali Amendment. Our third question relates to the issue of nitrous oxide, or N2O, which the report addresses. You explain in the report that, and I quote, anthropogenic N2O emissions are now the largest of the uncontrolled ODS emissions, since other larger emission sources have been phased out. Our delegation would like to know if you could put in layperson's terms the effect of the potential 3% reduction in anthropogenic N2O emissions you mentioned in the report. We also recall the UN Environmental Assembly nitrogen resolution agreed in 2022, where parties encouraged themselves to, and I quote, accelerate actions to significantly reduce nitrogen waste globally by 2030 and beyond through the improvement of sustainable nitrogen management. Could such efforts outside of the protocol help to reduce N2O emissions in a way that would favorably protect the ozone layer? Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup à la Micronésie. Je donne la parole au Libéria. Soyez concis. Merci.
Co-chair, and let me seize this opportunity to say on behalf of my government and people of Liberia, thanks to the government and people of Thailand for again hosting us. I also want to thank the cover of this meeting for their support that got us in this gathering today. Let me also say thanks to the assessment panels for their presentations. I have two simple questions, one which could be considered as a concern. First, it goes to the SAP. The most important objective of the Montreal Protocol is to ensure that our life-saving ozone layer is fully recovered at some point in time. Can the SAP place a percentage on the level of recovery of the ozone layer to date? Secondly, for most of us in this room, in this hall, and I hope I'm right, we are not as inclined scientifically as those of you on the SAP and the EEAP. So I am wondering if it is possible that when you are presenting on your findings, that you could probably simplify some of the scientific terminology so that we who are not as inclined as you are, will be able to grasp the idea and maybe take it home and be able to explain to those of our people who may want to know. That's my concern.
Merci, Oliveria. L'Union européenne, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And first of all, we'd like to thank very much the three assessment panels for these very comprehensive reports with a wealth of information. And because of so much information, we also have a lot of questions. But of course, we will try to be concise and precise on asking them to help you along. So if we turn to the SAP first, a few questions. First, what the SAP would consider the biggest short-term effect and magnitude to, which reductions of emissions could have the biggest short-term effect and magnitude to further reduce the equivalent effective stratospheric chlorine. Also, which reductions of emissions could have the biggest gain for fighting climate change in the short and in the long term. Following on from a question asked by India and also picked up or answered by the SAP, we would further inquire on the discrepancies between top-down and bottom-up. Which ones are the most important ones and what are the main reasons for these discrepancies as far as we know? And that includes also discrepancies with reporting data to the UNFCCC. Another question is on the global relevance of the other CFCs, and with other we mean the species such as 112A, 113A, 114A, etc., the ones we don't normally look at. And since they were highlighted in the report, we would like to have some more information. And finally, an update on stratospheric injection and solar radiation management, if there are any new findings since the report was compiled on this matter. Turning to the EEAP, we have a number of questions relating to the issue of the trifluoroacetic acid, TFA. We see in the report that there is some data on accumulation in plants. We also believe that there are some studies on evidence of phytotoxic effects, and we'd like the EEAP to comment on this. There is a lot of information, again, there's many pages on this, and we're thankful for that, but there is a relation of how much TFA when put in a large body of water, what that would mean, but shouldn't we also be concerned about smaller sinks, such as in surface water, and what the accumulation factors could be there in the future and any relevance for aquatic organisms. This also includes the evidence that we have TFA concentrations in rainwater growing, and shouldn't we consider that that might be a threat to our drinking waters in the future? Of course, we know that TFA is very persistent in the environment, and so we'd like to know from the EEAP if there's an effective way to get it out of the environment once it's out there. And finally, do we have a large-scale assessment made with an overview of all available studies on TFA? Are all the sinks and effects of TFA in the environment already exhaustively researched and known? And what do you see, if that's not the case, the existing data gaps on this issue? Finally, to the TIEP, on the matter of refrigeration and air conditioning. Just as basically a helicopter view, we'd like to know which sectors and which equipment cannot be covered by the natural alternatives, or rephrasing the questions, what cannot be done by using natural alternatives? Where are the limits for using them? On firefighting, we would like to know what is the uptake of available alternatives to the different remaining uses of halons at the global level. And finally, on N2O, and picking up from, I believe, Micronesia also, we would like to know on the relevance of the industry-derived emissions, or emissions that come from industry, and what the TIEP would see as a suitable way of tackling these. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup à l'Union européenne. Nous avions eu le Sénégal, la Mozambique, la Micronésie, le Libéria, l'Union européenne. Ce sont des questions qui ont été très pertinentes, très relevées. Et nous allons laisser la parole aux experts afin qu'ils puissent apporter des éléments de réponse en attendant que nous revenions pour la suite de la liste. Je vous remercie. Les experts vont se concerter pour apporter des éléments de réponse. Donc, nous leur donnons quelques minutes afin qu'ils puissent préciser les choses à leur niveau. Merci. Dès que vous êtes prêts, vous pouvez y aller. Allez-y.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I would like to address the questions that were asked by distinguished delegate from China. I will be very briefly and concise as we are run out of time, you mentioned. Regarding options for high temperature heat pumps above 100 degrees, in the chapter 10 of our assessment report that deals with industrial refrigeration, large installations, there are several refrigerant alternatives that are presented with all the details about their properties. I would mention as well the district heating alternative systems that have been implemented using ammonia. So this cover the alternative refrigerants for high temperature heat pumps. Regarding charge reduction for HFC system or equipment, refrigerant charge reduction, we have a specific section on chapter 773. And being very briefly, basically it's a question of the design of the equipment, the heat exchanger design using new architectures like micro channels or small diameter tubes, and also the design of and the sizing of the compressor, the volume of a compressor. Maybe I could say these are the two main strategies for charge reduction. And now I'm passed to my co-chair, colleague Omar, that you address other questions. Thank you.
Now, with regard to answering the questions from Senegal, with respect to the HAT environment and impact on the performance, what we decided to do this time is to include the impact of HAT in the different sectoral technology sectors in our different technologies throughout the RTOC report. So, for example, you will see the impact of HAT on air source or air-to-air air conditioners, and as well as engineered air conditioners. So, for example, for air-to-air air conditioners, we find which refrigerants work best, how to improve the performance, larger heat exchangers, and the impact on the refrigerant charge for engineered technologies like using chillers. We need to make sure that we use air-cooled chillers, not water-cooled chillers, mostly because of the high ambient temperature climates are in dry regions, and also impact of having the need for high capacity at high temperatures. With respect to energy efficiency equipment, we actually are including energy efficiency or responding to energy efficiency in the different chapters of RTOC. So within each technology sector, we have a sub-chapter on energy efficiency. Like for example, in chapter 4, which is the sealed system, there is a section on energy efficiency, which is section 4.7. In commercial refrigeration, there is a section on energy efficiency for both existing and or for retrofit application and new systems, which is section 5.6. In transport refrigeration, there is also a section which is 6.3, and so on and so forth. With respect to flammability, we responded to that in terms of looking at safety consideration and the impact of the updates in safety standards. So we put updates on safety standards with respect to, again, to the different technology sectors. So in each technology or end users, domestic refrigeration different than commercial refrigeration, different than, for example, air-cooled or room air conditioners, because in each technology or end-use sectors, there is a different end-use safety standard, and these are well described. If there is an update, that update is described. If there is a new refrigerant charge limit, that is also described. And in some specific applications or some specific conditions, we describe how we can cope with these new higher charges in terms of maintaining safety for the users. Thank you.
More questions?
Le SAP est prêt. Vous pouvez y aller. Nous attendons vos éléments de réponse.
Monsieur le Président, can we answer the question for EU while the SAP is prepping?
Yes.
L'Union européenne a posé plusieurs questions. L'une des questions s'agit de savoir quelle serait la réduction qui aurait plus de conséquences, une grande conséquence sur le réchauffement planétaire. Donc, en attendant...
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. There are, I would say, three things that could be done to have at least a short-term effect to reduce effective equivalent stratospheric chlorine. The first thing would be to control or remove ODS banks. That would have both an immediate and a long-term effect. The elimination of anthropogenic, very short-lived chlorine substances could have a very immediate effect because of its short lifetimes. And then the third thing would be the elimination of feedstock emissions could have a direct effect. The second question was the reduction of emissions that could generate large gains for fighting climate change. And certainly this is, I hate to pick on my IPCC and UNFCCC colleagues, but of course CO2, methane, and N2O, if they were controlled, maybe we wouldn't be as excited about this topic, but I won't pick on them. But we could get major gains if we controlled those three major greenhouse gases. With respect to substances controlled under the Montreal Protocol, Very high GWP hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, could yield very large gains. And I already mentioned eliminating banks. Limiting banks would also yield a nice gain for climate. It was also mentioned about the discrepancy between, the EU talked about the discrepancy between bottom-up and top-down observations or emission estimates, and also between UNFCCC reporting and atmospheric observations. And I actually quoted this earlier about the large discrepancies in HFCs. And again, the reports only account for about 31% of the global total CO2 equivalent emissions. There was the question from the EU on the global relevance on other CFCs, and in fact, there have been a number of CFCs that have been recently identified. At present, the emissions of those compounds is not large. They have been identified. So the global relevance is not large, but that's only at this point. As of yet, they're not large. I think this goes back to an early question about monitoring. We need to maintain, and Dave earlier referred to vigilance on this particular topic. So we need to keep our eyes on these other CFCs that have recently been identified in our atmosphere, and make sure that they don't grow to problems. So the last question about stratospheric injection solar radiation management, and I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, David Fahey.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate the question from Federated States of Micronesia and the European Union about SAI, or stratospheric aerosol injection. The first question was on timing in terms of effects on the ozone layer. The simple answer is quickly, that if we were to inject stratospheric aerosols such that it would have a meaningful change of global temperatures, for example, almost certainly it would have a meaningful change for stratospheric ozone. And that change would nominally occur within a year. We have volcanic analogs where we have seen explosive injections of aerosol into the stratosphere, and we have seen changes within a year. And as Paul Newman pointed out this morning, we will see effects of the injection of water vapor by the Hunga-Tonga volcano in this year's Antarctic ozone hole. And so the timing is within a year or so. Having said that, the effects will not be long-lived for something like the Hunga-Tonga injection, because the stratosphere cleans itself and that material would be removed to the lower atmosphere, as we've seen with other volcanic injections. The other question about more reality, more possibility for SAI, that's not a scientific question, but if one listens to the communication and discussion in the world today, certainly it has increased about this possibility of conducting stratospheric aerosol injection to cool the planet. And so one might interpret that as a higher reality. From the scientific side, though, what we would interpret it as even more urgency to provide the scientific foundation for any decision to actually conduct climate intervention or choose not to conduct climate intervention. And as we pointed out in our chapter in the 2022 assessment, there are substantial uncertainties with regard to the effects on stratospheric ozone, for example, and more broadly on the environment. And also from the European Union, they asked about new findings and the legal framework. Certainly there are new findings growing as more theoretical studies are conducted on this topic. And one generality might be that there are increasing detail and comprehensiveness in what the unintended effects of climate intervention might be. For example, on tropospheric weather, both trends and events. In terms of the legal framework, the world lacks that at the moment. I'm not sure it's closer to doing that. From the scientific side, what we would welcome is a possibility of doing a comprehensive international scientific assessment on this topic in order to support any legal framework that will eventually be created. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. One other question that was posed to us was in terms of N2O, the question from Micronesia, potential reduction in anthropogenic N2O emissions. And in fact, quoting directly from the executive summary, a 3% reduction of anthropogenic N2O emissions averaged over the 2023 to 2070 period would reduce or increase global ozone by about a half a Dobson unit, but it would decrease radiative forcing by 0.4 watts per meter squared, which is a fairly substantial decrease of radiative forcing. Just rolling along to some of the other questions that were posed. The question from Liberia about the percentage of recovery to date. And my colleague Bonfils Safari pointed out that we're expecting the ozone hole to recover to a natural level in around 2066. We have seen some evidence that ozone is increasing over Antarctica as chlorine and bromine decrease, but that recovery at this point is not particularly large. I don't actually have the percentage improvement at my fingertips, but we have seen things that are no longer getting worse, and they've recovered a bit, and that we expect full recovery by about 2066. David?
Yes, and we also appreciate the comment from the delegate from Liberia about wondering how information could be simplified further, that not all those who are interested in ozone depletion and the Montreal Protocol are scientific experts, for example, or technical experts. I would just hope that the document and product we introduced this morning, the 20 questions on ozone depletion produced by the SAP, would aid in that regard. In fact, that is our intention in putting that document together, is to create more accessible information on the basic features of the scientific aspects of ozone depletion, ozone depleting substances, and climate and ozone. So thank you.
Merci. Je pense que les éléments de réponse sont apportés, mais il me semble que je n'ai pas eu à entendre quelque chose comme réponse venant pour donner des points d'éclaircissement sur la question qui concerne l'oxyde nitreux. Il y a une question qui concerne l'oxyde nitreux et les éventuelles sources d'émission et d'élimination de ce produit. Et également, il y a un point qui était relatif à l'accumulation de produits dans les végétaux. Donc, si on peut nous donner quelques éléments pour vraiment nous rassurer, et ça nous ferait beaucoup plaisir. Allez-y. Dès que vous avez des éléments apportés, il y a le SAP qui est là, il y a l'EEA aussi qui est là, qui peut nous apporter des éléments. Merci. Oui, allez-y, allez-y. C'est l'EAP. Le type, allez-y.
Si. Si. Okay.
This is EEAP. I think there was a question first from Mozambique about why women have such high incidence of skin cancer, and that referred to a bar diagram. And this was a study done per region, and it was not Mozambique. The highest rates of skin cancer was for Australia and New Zealand, and that was for women in Australia and New Zealand. And actually Mozambique is not on that bar diagram, so that's good news. The other question questions that the EU took up with TFA and its accumulation and phytotoxic effects, and if there's any way in which to remove TFA. First of all, there are very few studies done, so the conclusions are not always robust, but I think the most important thing is that if you look at the concentration in oceans, it's based on a value of 200 nanograms per liter of TFA for a volume of about 1.36 by 109 cubic kilometers, and that's 200 nanograms per liter for oceans. And I think the EU was also concerned for more smaller bodies of water. But if we do go back to the oceans, 1 nanogram is 1 gram to the 9th, 10 to the 9th, so it's extremely small. And we found that there are only 2 studies that were done on aquatic plants tested so far, and no observed effect. There was no observed effect at very high concentrations done in a laboratory setting. And to get back to smaller amounts of water, there was a study done in Germany on rainwater samples. And the average concentration there of TFA was 703 nanograms per liter. And again, there was a laboratory rat experiment, and these rats were given TFA salts in drinking water, and very, very high concentrations, up to 600 milligrams. So instead of normal concentrations of, say, 200 nanograms per liter, this was 600 milligrams per liter, and there was no significant effects at 30 milligrams, and at 120 and 600 milligrams, there were a few potential effects of enzyme activity arising from the liver. But for animals, and including humans, the most important message seems to be that although there is a lot of TFA that accumulates or can accumulate in the environment, it is water soluble, so therefore it does not accumulate. And I think that's often forgotten. But that said, we don't know the full story yet of any potential biological effects of TFA. So we do encourage continuous monitoring and assessment of any potential effects that might come. And some of the other studies that were done on plants and even on the aquatic plant, terrestrial and aquatic plant, I think that the EU asked what the effect was or how it was measured, and this was done looking at the growth of the plants. And again, very much below the toxicity levels. But as said, we advocate continuous monitoring and assessment in case we are missing something. At the moment, there are very few studies done that we can use. Thank you. I now pass on to my co-chair colleague, Paul Barnes. You've got one too, it might be easier.
So this is a response, I believe, to Senegal's question about the modeling studies on skin cancer and cataract conducted by the U.S. EPA for U.S. population. And my understanding, I think it just needs some clarification. The modeling study really calculated skin cancer, cataract beginning in 1980, which is the common benchmark for the period just beginning ozone depletion, but it included humans that were born beginning in 1890, so it would have included 90-year-old people. So the actual model did not calculate all the way back to 1890 in terms of UV exposure. It only really began in 1980, but it included older people in that study. That's my understanding.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Les experts nous ont apporté des informations complémentaires qui font foi et qui peuvent nous permettre d'avoir des points d'éclaircissement sur certains aspects de leur présentation. À présent, nous allons poursuivre avec la liste. Nous allons donner la parole à l'Afrique du Sud et ensuite à l'Argentine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And the delegation of South Africa would like to first thank the government of Thailand for the warm welcome and the hospitality. We would also like to thank and congratulate the Secretariat on a great organization of the meeting, including the workshop that we had yesterday. And this delegation is looking forward to further discussions on the outcomes of that workshop. We would like to thank the assessment panels for the great work that they always do with regards to providing us with the necessary information as we request them to. I have two questions, one to the SAP, and I think it has been covered a little bit, but I have not gotten the specifics. There was a statement with regards to uncertainty on CFC 11 seizing and also on quantities and origins of other unexplained emissions. I know the co-chairs have spoken about remaining vigilant. I just wanted to check if there is any specific work that the SAP is aware of that is looking specifically into those aspects. My next question is to the EEAP. Also, in their presentation, they have made a statement, and I quote, currently a lack of quantitative data on how changes in UV radiation in combination with climate change will affect food security, plant and animals migration, and biodiversity. I wanted to check with the panel if there is any work done to be able to get that data, and particularly looking at collaborations with other scientific or environmental panels from other multilateral environmental agreements that are looking at biodiversity and conservation, that are looking into issues of climate change and others. Lastly, there is, I think in the same presentation towards the end, there are slides that talk about plastic debris on the Montreal Protocol. Again, in relation to collaboration with other MEAs, there is obviously a drive towards a plastics instrument. I wanted to check if there's any collaboration with regards to, or collaboration or any linkages with regards to the current work that is happening with regards to the establishment of the plastics instrument. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci à l'Afrique du Sud. L'Argentine, s'il vous plaît.
Muchas gracias, señor copresidente. En primer lugar, dado que esta es la primera vez que la delegación está tomando la palabra, me gustaría agradecer al gobierno del Reino de Tailandia por su hospitalidad y por recibirnos en esta hermosa ciudad. En segundo lugar, me gustaría agradecerle a la Secretaría del Ozono por organizar este encuentro. Y por último, desde ya agradecer al panel de asesoramiento tecnológico y económico, al panel de asesoramiento científico y al grupo de evaluación de efectos ambientales por su trabajo y la elaboración de estos valiosos informes. En cuanto a la información compartida, esta delegación está un poco confundida, ya que en su reporte anterior el TIP había mencionado los problemas de abastecimiento que existían, mientras que ahora este informe indica que dichos problemas se estarían resolviendo cuando, por lo menos en nuestra región, eso estaría un poco lejos de que ocurra. En la última reunión del Comité Ejecutivo, a nuestro país se le aplicó una reducción en los fondos de la etapa 2 por un exceso en la meta de consumo fijada en el acuerdo con el Fondo Multilateral. Este exceso se debió a la imposibilidad de evitar la asignación de licencias de HCFC22 ante el riesgo de desabastecer la cadena nacional de frío, pero fundamentalmente a la imposibilidad de cumplir con la implementación del sector de pequeños usuarios de HCFC 141B en el sector de espumas de poliuretano debido a la falta de alternativas. Argentina hizo un esfuerzo inconmensurable, cuyos resultados son destacables por tener una diferencia mínima, considerando las circunstancias resultantes de la pandemia del COVID-19, las demoras de los fletes internacionales y más aún tratándose de un phase-out acelerado. No obstante, esta situación, ahora también tenemos que analizar el impacto que tendrá la cuestión de los PFA sobre los HFO. Además, en este informe el TIP menciona que no existen opciones drop-in directas, mientras que la mayoría de los proyectos para el sector de espumas fueron aprobados con HFO como alternativas. Por todo lo mencionado, consideramos que las partes deben considerar esta cuestión, porque no se puede continuar aplicando reducciones a los países que se vean impedidos en cumplir ante la ausencia de alternativas. Y por último, el reporte menciona la producción de aires acondicionados domésticos tipo split con R290 en Latinoamérica y nos gustaría saber específicamente en qué país se ha identificado dicha producción. Muchas gracias.
Merci à l'Argentine. Nous donnons la parole à l'Éthiopie. Éthiopie, vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, for giving us the floor. We also want to join those who congratulate and thank the 3 assessment panels for their excellent work they have done. It was really interesting to listen all the fact and scientific analysis they provided, and I hope we will use them all for our decision as a base in the meeting and beyond. It was also quite interesting and encouraging to listen. The number of ODS are continuously decreasing from the atmosphere. The scientific facts and figures from all assessment panels will help us to answer many questions for our key stakeholders who have significant contribution in phasing down and phasing out substance that has been identified as high global warming and ozone depleting potential to meet our obligation in the Montreal Protocol and protect human health and the environment. Having said this, Mr. Co-Chair, my question is linked with emission related with methyl bromide that has been mentioned in SAP report. In the report, it was mentioned that the emission of methyl bromide has increased from 2018 to 2020, showed an increase from 6.9 parts per trillion to 9 point something parts per trillion, with no specific trend. This is an indication to take some measures on potential source of emission, and this delegation curious about and look for further information on the potential and possible source of emission. In our understanding, there was no significant increase of new use of methyl bromide during this period, and what would be the contribution of the increasing the global ODS in the atmosphere and associated impact. We also want to learn about, and we hope the panel has data about global stockpile and what will be the global gain if we focus on working on sound disposal of obsolete methyl bromide, which we have been stocked it for many years. Thank you, Co-Chair, for the floor again.
Nous allons poursuivre en donnant la parole au Koweït. Honorable délégué du Koweït, vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And as my country take the floor for the first time, we would like to thank the people and the government of Kingdom of Thailand for their hospitality, and also we extend our appreciation to the Ozone Secretariat and the Ozone Secretariat team for organizing this meeting. I will never forget also to thank the panelists and the panel people and experts for their excellent job and a lot of documentation and proven things to do. So saying that, we also have our relating question to verify. My first question will be for the EEAP. It's a very small clarification needed from them. What is the scientific basis for them for the microplastic as a carbon sinks, how they reach to that element? Now I'll transfer my question directly as previous delegates cover a lot of things. I will only concentrate on the RTOC from TIEB. In the RTOC messages, in the presentation, they have RTOC messages number 1. It's mentioned directly that indirect global GHG is very high rather than the global warming coming from the direct of refrigerant. And that statement is very carefully to be addressed, because if my understanding from TIEB is saying that we can use high GWP if the equipment is more efficient than others. So this is a way of dealing that acceptance and working with high GWP is acceptable if the machine is very, very, very powering and efficient. The second thing that in the same page is that there's a new era and a new terminology that the TIEB and RTOC start using, which is performance building. And I want to understand, this is the performance of the building, of the envelope of the building, or the way that we are running the building itself. It's need more clarity on that terminology, because building envelopes and like this, it's not in the jurisdiction of the ozone unit in our regions. And in RTOC message 2, he talked about accessibility and its hinders. We want to understand why these technologies and an alternative have a problem in their accessibility in some region or some countries, because the message was very broad. So we want to reach to that element. And if we look to the message number 3, the problem was mentioning that the role, because of the the role under the table, which she have alternatives mentioning in a table for this alternative. The message directly beyond this table was mentioning that these alternatives is temporarily role for the phase down process, as they are GWB may still be high future application. And I don't understand that one, because you already mentioned it in the message one that the indirect emission is 70% than the direct emission from GWB alternative. So it's a discrepancy for me in the technology and terminology that I need to have more clarity about it, because that is very important for us when we are selecting alternatives and to be sustainable with this alternative for us. In key messages number 4, in the commercial refrigeration in the last point, it's mentioned that it is HFO blend, and directly in message number 5, the same alternative was mentioned in another terminology, which is HFCs and HFO blend. So I want to understand, this is a typo mistake or another terminology, or on which basis we can say this is an HFO blend, and when we can see this is an HFCs and HFO blend, because both of them are containing HFCs. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup au Koweït. Nous allons donner à présent la parole aux États-Unis et nous allons rester là pour ce tour de liste. Nous allons reprendre avec les pays suivants, l'Égypte, Kenya, Canada, Chili et Cuba. Donc, États-Unis, vous avez la parole. Et après les États-Unis, les experts vont nous apporter les éléments de réponse, puis nous allons reprendre avec la liste qui est restée en attente. Merci beaucoup. Les États-Unis, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Let me start by expressing our appreciation to all three panels. I really think the service they provide this body is invaluable in providing scientific information to us as policymakers that we can then deliberate on. In the interest of time, let me just jump into some of the questions that we had. I'd like to start first with the SAP. The first question we had for them is on the slide that they presented on HFC 23. The question I had is the information that is referred to in that slide, it basically said there's information suggesting a substantial increase in the abatement of HFC 23 emissions. And I think they were contrasting that with the atmospheric measurements, which perhaps suggest otherwise. So we were actually interested in what the source of that information is that they were using to suggest that there was a substantial increase in abatement of HFC 23 emissions. The second item we had a question about is there was also in the SAP's presentation, they spoke about the impending loss of space-borne instruments. And I guess we would appreciate, a little bit more elaboration on the implications of the loss of this instrumentation for us as policymakers, and I guess whether we in fact should be concerned that we're losing our ability to track some of the changes in the stratosphere that are important to the overall efforts we're undertaking to protect the ozone layer. The third question I had, actually Ethiopia partly asked this question, but just to build on it, with respect to what they presented on methyl bromide, it is my understanding correct that in recent years the atmospheric measurements suggest a range of between 6.5 to 6.9 parts per trillion concentrations of methyl bromide, of which 5.5 parts per trillion are from natural sources. So maybe just a question for SAP, either to confirm my understanding of the information is correct, or if not, if they could perhaps explain that a little bit more for us. And then lastly, with respect to the SAP, really just wanted to express first appreciation for the elaboration on stratospheric aerosol injection. We got really a chapter on that, a much greater elaboration on information, which I think is quite important for this body to be aware of. We had a question, but I think they actually just answered our question, so I'll just express that appreciation, as well as for the 20 questions document is really fantastic. It's very accessible, so just our thanks for all the work that goes into that. And then I had 3 questions for the TEEP. The first one is for the FS talk. If you could provide additional information on the destruction of halon that was noted in your presentation, which it's a little peculiar to us, of course, because there's also a concern we may be running out of halon. So anything that they could further provide on why this happened. Was it usable halon? Like, in other words, was this somehow like contaminated halon that couldn't be used? Or was this halon that otherwise could have been part of a usable bank? And was it destroyed for a particular reason? For example, what's driving this? Is this sort of like corporate sustainability commitments, or why exactly was it being destroyed? The second question, and this is for the MC talk, we listened to the response to China, and we have a follow-up question, which is whether the MC talk could clarify whether we understood correctly. Did they say that there's Article 7 reporting for HFC used for electronics such as etching and solvent cleaning, that it is coming in reporting as feedstock use and not as production and consumption? So perhaps if they could confirm that that's what they said. And then it's our own understanding that HFC use for semiconductor etching does not actually involve a transformation of the HFC into another chemical substance that we would sort of think of as a feedstock into another process. So if the MC talk could clarify the chemical pathway for etching and whether such a transformation takes place. And then lastly, also with respect to the MC talk, so I think just to express appreciation, I think they identified an important issue there with respect to the processes for TFE and HFP with respect to emissions of a couple of high global warming potential substances. One of those we're very familiar with, which is HFC 23. The other is, I think, was PFC C318. I think it would be useful, I guess, in the near term here to ask them if there's any further information or details that they could provide more specifically on the sources of those emissions, and maybe a longer term question as to whether, if we as a body asked, could they dig into this a little bit more, including to get some more information to sort of assess these emissions, in particular the quantity of actual emissions, because I think they sort of had some, like a very rough, sort of maximum envelope type estimate in some of the information we saw. But I guess just a question there as to whether there's further data and information. I think from this delegation's perspective, the information provided suggests that there could be some significant impacts just because the GWP of these substances are so high. So maybe if the MC Talk could further elaborate on whether there might be in future reports, if they were asked, additional information that could shed more light and create a better understanding in this body of the environmental implications of these byproduct emissions from these processes as well. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup aux délégués des États-Unis. À présent, nous allons permettre aux experts d'apporter les éléments de réponse. Il y a eu l'Afrique du Sud comme intervenant. Nous avons accueilli l'Afrique du Sud, l'Argentine, l'Éthiopie, le Koweït et les États-Unis. Toutes les questions qui ont été posées sont des questions qui vont nous faciliter la compréhension des choses, les questions environnementales, les questions qui sont liées notamment à certains produits qui sont dans l'atmosphère. Nous allons aborder aussi les questions relatives au stock de hallons, les questions qui posent des préoccupations par rapport à la transformation des HFC, notamment quand il s'agit des produits décapants ou bien quand il s'agit de leur utilisation dans les microprocesseurs. Donc, je vais laisser la parole aux experts pour nous apporter des éléments de réponse pertinents et pour éclairer notre lanterne. Vous avez la parole, les experts, vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Co-Chair, I'd like to address some questions for the refrigeration air condition talk. The first, it was not a simple question that was made by a distinguished delegate from EU that asked about the limits for the use of natural refrigerants. The answer somehow was mentioned in one of our key messages when we said that the choice for refrigerant is based on weighing several factors, which include environmental issues, suitability for the application, safety assessment, and regional and national regulations. So it's a group of criteria that need to be taken into consideration. One example, considering the energy efficiency or energy consumption, that's one of the criterion, is the case of the CO2 transcritical system. It's a natural refrigerant installation that was not used in warmer climates because of the energy penalty. And then with the technology development, multi-ejector, parallel compression, transcritical CO2 systems are used also in warmer countries. So technology is also driving a force for establishing the limits for the use of natural refrigerant. Regarding the question, a specific question that was made by Argentina about manufacture of propane R290 air conditioning equipment in South America, the answer is a Colombian company, it's called Thermotar, that started with a demonstration project funded by the multilateral fund that manufactures propane-based air conditioning equipment, ducted package, not mini splits, but splits and ducted package equipment using propane as a refrigerant. And I pass to my colleague that will address the question from Kuwait. Please.
All right. So the first question about the difference between the high GWP and for direct and versus indirect impact, the answer is we cannot address one factor without addressing the other one. And in general, right now, most industrialized countries are moving towards higher energy efficiency product, but also working with lower global warming potential refrigerants, because we want to tackle both sides of the donut as that was presented. We cannot just address one without addressing the other. When talking about the systems perspective, like building energy efficiency, the answer here is integration and synergy. If we can reduce the cooling demand, improve energy efficiency, then we can reduce the capacity required and reduce the system charge. So it has a multitude of benefit. We reduce the energy emission, but also reduce the charge and reduce the overall impact or climate impact. So, synergy 1 + 1 = 4. In terms of accessibility and how it hinders the Kigali Amendment and the progress towards Kigali Amendment, again, the key word here is funding and the impact, especially on importing countries or developing countries that are receiving on the receiving end of the spectrum. There is a dual responsibility between importing and exporting countries. The problem is the importing countries don't have the regulatory framework to enable only allowing those those equipment that have lower GWP refrigerant that also are energy efficient, and that creates some disparity. Then there was the question about the refrigerants being transitional, and the answer here is the approach that the world is taking is a phased approach. We are moving from where we were with a very high GWP refrigerant towards something that we can work with, and eventually we want to reach towards our end goal, which is 15 or 25% of what we are in right now, following the Kigali phase down schedule. And the key word here is what are the technology available and how we can work with them so that we do not disrupt the market. With respect to HFO blends, HFC blends, thanks for pointing this out. Indeed, this is a typo, and we accept, or please accept our apologies. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to reply to the United States question about the Halon that was destroyed. The Halon 1301 that was destroyed was done so under a carbon credit system to satisfy corporate environmental sustainability goals. The Halon was recovered from a fire suppression system and was perfectly usable. We knew about this and asked the company not to go ahead and do this, but they went ahead anyway. We are concerned that this could set a precedent and lead to further destruction of good Halon, which would deplete the bank and could lead to a need for future production. While I've got the floor, I'd like to reply also to some previous questions that were asked in the sessions. Turning to the question from Senegal sometime earlier, the question was about new Halon alternatives. Our assessment report lists many existing Halon alternatives and alternatives indeed to high GWP HFCs. In terms of new alternatives, however, the fire suppression TOC is not aware of any new fire suppression agents that are in any kind of advanced development stage. And as we reported previously, the timescale for development and approval of a new agent is long, certainly in excess of 10 years. So I think it's safe to assume there's nothing around the corner. Turning to the questions from the EU, which was to do with the global changeover to Halon alternatives. In terms of Halon 1301, with the exception of civil aviation, and by that I mean aircraft engines and the cargo compartments, All new halon fire suppression systems do not use halon 1301. However, there are several enduring or legacy uses, as I indicated earlier, military, oil and gas, nuclear power plants, etc., where retrofit of the original halon system is not practical or feasible, and this could be for several reasons: available space, the weight of the system, temperature requirements, etc. There are still some fixed systems protecting, for example, telecom suites and some marine uses. These are typically decommissioned at the end of life of the asset, and the halon is recovered, recycled, and in fact becomes the supply to create the available 1301 bank to support these other enduring uses, for example, civil aviation. In terms of halon 1211, the only significant use remaining now of halon 1211 is portable extinguishers in civil aviation. I'm pleased to report that all new aircraft are fitted with a halon replacement, 2 BTP, and for the existing aircraft fleets, the 1211 is gradually being replaced. However, as we will discuss further tomorrow, 2 BTP could be considered a PFAS under some definitions, including the one from the OECD, which is used predominantly by the European Union ECHA. Thank you.
Oui, vous avez la parole. D'ici. Oui, allez-y, vous avez la parole. Honorable expert, vous avez la parole, allez-y. Je n'arrive pas à percevoir ce qui est écrit, mais...
Okay. Thank you. It's the TEEP, and I'll just respond to the questions from the US delegation. Okay, I've got a... All right, so firstly there was a question around clarifying the treatment of HFC 23 production and consumption in semiconductor manufacturing as either under Article 7 reporting, whether that's treated as production and consumption or whether that's treated as feedstock use, and for us to elaborate the chemical pathway. So first perhaps to explain that when HFC 23, for example, is used as an etching gas, you combine it with silicon as the substrate to be etched. In the plasma process, the HFC 23 forms ions, radicals, and then there are fluorine radicals that react with the silicon substrate to create the silicon fluoride coating. It is a grey area, which is why we wanted to bring it to parties' attention as to how you want to treat it as parties. I guess from our perspective, it's not clear. I wouldn't say I would consider it, that process, a traditional feedstock type use, which we would consider perhaps more likely to be the addition of two chemicals coming together and being and creating a new chemical and then having that chemical isolated. That's kind of our understanding of what a feedstock use is. But we bring it to parties' attention because it probably needs clarification. The second question relates to TFE and HFP production from HCFC 22 and associated emissions of HFC 23 and PFC C318. And there was a question about, I think, those emissions and whether we would be able to dig further in to do an assessment of that. There was also a question around, we've obviously provided a maximum estimate there of possible 23 and PFC emissions from those processes. If we were to do more work on that, we would certainly be grateful for parties to provide more accurate data because we used the data that we had available, and as pointed out, that provides a maximum. we don't currently have information, accurate information on possible emission factors, and would need that. And we also don't have information about current levels of abatement. So we would need all of that information to be able to do that. We don't have information on whether those processes currently require incineration in parties, thermal oxidation, to destroy those emissions. And we would be grateful for parties to provide that information on whether those processes in their countries currently require incineration or not. So to be able to do work, we would need additional information. Then I think there was another question around providing additional information on the environmental implications of those processes. Given our lack of understanding on whether there's abatement or not, I guess that's a bit of a question mark as to what those environmental implications would be, which was why we included it in the report and asked parties to consider the significance of the potential of those emissions, the potential impacts of those emissions. I don't think there was anything else. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup aux experts. Il faut dire que vraiment nous avons des contraintes de temps, mais il y a des points qui n'ont pas été abordés. Donc je vais laisser les experts poursuivre leurs interventions. Je note au passage qu'il y a des questions sur les microplastiques. Ça n'a pas été abordé. Et il y a les questions aussi, il y a une question sur les HFO mélangés, mélange de HFO. Donc, vous avez la parole. Intervenez. Vous pouvez réagir. Il y a le EAP et il y a le SAP. Vous pouvez allez-y, vous pouvez intervenir.
In response to the question from South Africa regarding our inability to quantify the magnitude of the effects of changes in UV radiation on ecosystem biodiversity, productivity, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon storage. The answer to that is several-fold. In some cases, we lack basic knowledge on the effects. For example, we know very little about how UV radiation affects biodiversity, and we can't really quantify that. In some cases, we have some information from experiments, but we can't scale that to a level where we can really quantify that in an assessment way. This requires models, and in some cases, the models don't exist. Relatively simple models looking at UV and climate interactions on crop yield, for example. Some studies have been done, and those show mostly an effect of climate change, not so much in UV. But those are relatively rare as well. For natural systems, it becomes much more complicated because natural systems are inherently much more complicated than agricultural ecosystems. We recognize the limitations of our assessments in this inability to quantify these effects, so we are bringing in modelers into our panel that can help us with these efforts, and we're also in our next panel meeting, we're actually holding a workshop in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to perhaps develop partnerships where we can begin to use or encourage modeling efforts to really try to quantify these. So we recognize the limitations. Some of it is due to a limitation of knowledge. Some of it is a limitation of just the existence of modeling approaches that allow us to quantify these things. So that's the answer to that.
There was also a question as to whether the information we gave on the plastics, if we were doing or if we had any collaboration. and with other bodies, with other agencies, and at the moment we do not, but we value that comment and we will certainly work on that. I'll just pass the next comment on plastics to my co-panel, co-chair.
Yeah. Yeah, hello. Yeah, this is regarding microplastics, a question raised by Kuwait on microplastic as carbon sink. Actually, we would like to clarify that microplastics are not the carbon sink. It is the plastic material or plastic products before they get down, they get broken down, are this carbon sink, as it stores carbon from which it is made. So these plastics products get broken down to small fragments due to the photo-oxidative process. Microplastics are generated in the environment during fragmentation of especially photo-oxidized plastic litters. So these microplastics are not the carbon sink. Microplastics are an emerging class of pollutants in air, soil, and in all aquatic environments. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. To the delegate from South Africa, with regard to CFC-11, the scientific community maintains its vigilance by continuing to measure CFC-11 and related substances, by tracking their emissions, by working with TEEP to understand emission magnitudes from banks created from production before 2010 and the newly produced banks. And more generally, I'll say that scientists in the SAP continue their efforts to refine and improve methodologies and observational networks to enable more accurate and precise estimates of emissions for all Montreal Protocol gases. With respect to question from the Ethiopian delegate and also with help from the US delegate, regarding recent changes in methyl bromide. Yes, sorry for the confusion. To be clear, its atmospheric abundance has varied between 6.5 and 6.9 parts per trillion over the 2016 to 20 period. So showing no systematic trend or change over that period, just more year-to-year variability, consistent with the known anthropogenic production and emission changes over that time. They've been fairly constant over that period as well. And yes, with regard to the clarification from the US, 5.5 or 5.5 ppt is indeed what we estimate based on measurements from air trapped in snow and ice in Antarctica, what the pre-industrial atmospheric level for methyl bromide was. Thank you. And finally, with respect to the question from the delegate from the United States regarding HFC 23, correct. The point was that HFC 23, global emission magnitude and trend derived from atmospheric measurements, contrasts with expectations of a substantial increase in abatement of those 23 emissions. And the source of that abatement information is cited in the report as being reports of the XCOM to the MLF related to implementation of the Montreal Protocol, and more specifically by those reports related to product emissions of HFC 23. So I hope that addresses the questions.
Oui, il y a d'autres éléments. Allez-y.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. The U.S. Was asking about the implications of the loss of satellites, and I would like to point out that there are several satellites age. They eventually, instruments degrade in space with time, and so there are several spaceborne instruments providing vertically resolved global measurements of ozone-related atmospheric constituents, and they're due to be retired in the next few years. Specifically, the AURA satellite and its microwave limb sounder is getting old. It is going to continue operation through this year, but Aura is at the close of its life. It has been orbiting since 2004, and we optimistically expect that it will continue taking measurements into 2025. There are a few missions that are in planning that would make similar observations. Unfortunately, those satellites and instruments are not approved, and they would be operational in approximately 2030 at the earliest, if they are approved. There are lots of competing satellites, competing scientific topics that could lead to them not being funded. So there will be a gap in our ability to monitor the stratosphere, particularly for specific chemicals that are involved with ozone depletion. If you look at the 20 questions and answers, in question 7, there's a figure that shows chlorine monoxide, which is directly involved in ozone depletion, HCl, which is one of the reservoir species of chlorine in the stratosphere, nitric acid, which is an intimate gas involved with ozone depletion in the Arctic and the Antarctic. These observations will go away, and there will be a gap. There are satellites that will continue to make ozone profiles and aerosol profiles, so ozone and aerosol alone. These include the NOAA Polar Orbiter Series, the European Space Agency's TROPE-OMI instrument. The Canadian ACE instrument measures a number of chemicals, but it is also an older instrument. It won't last forever, but I'm not sure exactly when that will be decommissioned or returned to, Earth. So we will have a gap, and these are important constituents that we will not be measuring. Thank you.
Beaucoup. À l'heure actuelle, nous pensons que suffisamment d'éléments de réponse ont été apportés et que l'essentiel des préoccupations ont été évacuées. Nous allons nous excuser parce que nous avons des contraintes de temps. Et nous allons reprendre avec une nouvelle liste, mais nous allons boucler après l'intervention du Cuba. Il y a d'autres parties qui sont sur la liste, notamment il y a 5, et entre-temps d'autres se sont encore ajoutés. Donc, vous voyez, si nous laissons, on va pas en finir avec les demandes de parole pour les questions. Donc, nous allons boucler après le Cuba. Et ceux qui ont des préoccupations et qui voudraient toujours avoir des éléments de réponse peuvent toujours s'approcher des experts. Ils sont là avec nous. On peut les approcher et avoir avec eux des conversations très, très fructueuses et qui peuvent toujours nous apporter des éléments de réponse. Donc, à présent, je dois donner la parole à l'Égypte. Je donne la parole à l'Égypte pour sa question. Merci.
شكرا لإعطاء الكلمة. بداية أود أن أهنئ الرئيسان المشاركان لاختيارهم وحسن إدارتهم هذه الجلسة، ونتمنى لهم كل التوفيق. وأضم صوتي إلى من تقدموا بالشكر لحكومة وشعب تايلاند وإلى سكرتارية الأوزون على الإعداد الجيد لهذا الاجتماع. أضم صوتي أيضا إلى من سبقوني بشكر الرؤساء والأعضاء الموقرين في لجان التقييم، ونقدر جهودهم الطوعية التي يبذلونها في إعداد تقارير نافعة لعملنا في وحدات الأوزون الوطنية. والحقيقة أن من سبقوني قد سألوا الكثير من الأسئلة واستمعنا إلى العديد من الإجابات، ولكن دعني أسأل بعض الأسئلة البسيطة بما أني أخذت الكلمة. سؤال سياب SAP. لقد لاحظنا ظهور جاب أو يعني هناك فجوة كبيرة في توزيع شبكات الرصد والقياس، فهل لديكم توصيات محددة كيف نتغلب على هذا التوزيع الجغرافي الغير جيد في شبكات الرصد والقياس؟ السؤال الثاني إلى الجياب، والرسالة الأولى للأرتوك كي مسج، كما ذكر يعني الزميل الموقر من الكويت أن الاندايركت أو الانبعاثات الغير مباشرة تمثل 70%، وقد استمعنا إلى يعني الإجابة والتوضيح، ولكن يعني سؤالي هنا، هل الفريق المعني بتعبئة موارد الصندوق هل له أن يأخذ ذلك في الاعتبار بتخصيص ميزانيات مناسبة لدرج كفاءة الطاقة وتخفيض الانبعاثات الغير مباشرة لما له من منافع كبيرة للمناخ؟ أخيراً 20 سؤال وجواب، هل هما تحديث أو آخر تحديث، وهل هما يصدر بلغة واحدة أم سيتم ترجمتهم إلى جميع اللغات وخاصة العربية لما لذلك نفع في يعني عملنا في لجان الأذون الوطنية، وأشكركم جدا. شكرا.
Merci beaucoup, honorable délégué de l'Égypte. Je donne la parole au Kenya pour son intervention. Le Kenya, vous avez la parole.
Yes, thank you, Co-Chair. First, we want to join the rest of the other speakers in thanking the government of Thailand for the cordial welcome, and also to thank the Ozone Secretariat for organizing this particular meeting. Further, we would also wish to thank the assessment panel for their comprehensive assessment reports and also the presentations. Co-Chair would want to seek further clarification and elaboration on two particular issues. Number one goes to the environmental effect assessment panel. Although this question had been asked by Mozambique, but I think we didn't get proper clarification because the question was asked why women are experiencing high incidences. So that clarification was not given out. So we would wish that the panel give the reasoning behind why the women are becoming more susceptible to melanoma other than their male counterparts. The second question that we have, Co-Chair, is to the MT talk. And from the report, I think it was indicated that alternatives to methylbromide use in QPR are available. But if that is so, we'd wish to know whether these alternatives are easily accessible and affordable. Thank you.
Beaucoup au Kenya pour le type de questions, du type de réponse aussi qui sera apporté. Votre question a été succincte, très intéressante. Et je vais donner la parole au Canada.
Merci, Monsieur le Co-Président. First, I'd like to join other delegations and thank the three assessment panel for the tremendous work they have undertaken in the preparation of their quadrennial reports. There's many things that I can say about it, but given the time, I will go directly to our questions. So 2 questions to the scientific assessment panel. One to the medical and chemical talk, and one to the fire suppression talk. For the scientific assessment panel, we just heard from them a couple of times that action on very short-lived substances could have a significant near-term impact on the ozone layer recovery. We know that at this stage, the SAP has not assigned actual ozone depleting potential to most short-lived compounds. But we noted that in the report by the MC Talk, they quoted a study by Claxton et al. That considered ranges of ozone depleting potential for dichloromethanes and a few other short-lived compounds. So our questions to the SAP is if they've considered those ODPs, and if at some point in the future they would be able to assign ozone depleting potentials or range of potentials for some of the key very short-lived substances. Second question to the SAP is, we noted that abundance of CTC carbon tetrachlorides continues to decrease, albeit at a slower rate. Yet we noticed that the global CTC emissions estimates in the 2022 assessment report are actually higher than the ones in the 2018 report. So in the 2022 report, emissions of CTC are around 44 gigagrams per year, whereas in the 2018 report, the average was reported to be about 35 gigagrams per year. We understand from the report that this change is due to an improved lifetime estimate for CTC. We would appreciate perhaps a little bit more information about this from the SAP, because unfortunately what this means is that now the gap between top-down and bottom-up emissions of CTC, which was previously reported as having been reduced, has increased again. And it would be important, I think, given the importance that this body has placed over the past couple of years on the CTC discrepancy, to better understand why. Now for the TIPS MC talk, and this joins a little bit the questions from the United States, we're also very interested in the detailed information in the report describing the many chemical pathways through which HFC byproduction may be generated. Now we're aware that there's an additional report by the TIP on HFC-23 that is supposed to come to the MOP as per decision 34/7. We were wondering whether this report, do you expect that it will provide information on additional chemical pathways that are not identified in the current MC Talk report, or if, for all intents and purposes, you believe that all the main pathways that generate HFC-23 have been identified in the quadrennial reports. Furthermore, would the MC Talk be able to tell us whether the emissions of HFC-23 from processes that were identified other than the production of HCFC-22 could, at least to some extent, explain some of the very large discrepancy between top-down and bottom-up estimates of HFC-23 emissions, which has been mentioned, was highlighted in the SAP assessment report. Finally, with respect to our questions for the Fire Suppression Technical Options Committee, considering the scenarios presented in their report on the possible run-out dates for Halon 1301, and the very large range among these scenarios, the run-out dates going from between 2030 and 2049, could the FC Talk provide an indication as to where lie the largest uncertainties? For example, whether the uncertainties in those dates relates more to the estimates for existing banks or to emission rates, and what would be needed, what kind of information would be needed for the FC Talk to be able to reduce this uncertainty and thus narrow the range. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué du Canada. Nous allons donner la parole au délégué de Chili pour son intervention. Chili, vous avez la parole.
Muchas gracias, señor copresidente. Dado que es la primera vez que nuestra delegación se dirige a la Asamblea, queremos expresar nuestro agradecimiento al Reino de Tailandia por su hospitalidad al acoger esta reunión y a la Secretaría por distribuir de manera oportuna los documentos y preparar de forma excelente esta sesión del Grupo de Trabajo de Composición Abierta. Señor copresidente, coincidimos con la delegación argentina en la importancia de tener alternativas de HFO para las espumas de poliuretano. A pesar de los retos presentes, como la escasa disponibilidad de HFOs y sus elevados costos, nuestro país se mantiene firme en este compromiso. Las empresas involucradas en proyectos de conversión financiadas por el FML están enfrentando una pérdida de competitividad debido a la limitada disponibilidad y precios altos de los HFOs. En contraste con las empresas que decidieron no participar en los proyectos de conversión y optaron por seguir utilizando HFCs. Señor copresidente, entendemos que se han referido brevemente a la pregunta realizada por Argentina y lamentamos ser insistentes. Sin embargo, solicitamos encarecidamente que el TIP evalúe la situación de países como los nuestros que decidieron implementar una reducción acelerada del HCFC 141B, por lo cual estamos convencidos de que, trabajando juntos, encontraremos soluciones que favorezcan tanto al medio ambiente como a la industria. Muchas gracias, señor copresidente.
Merci beaucoup pour la préoccupation qui a été exposée. Je donne la parole au Cuba et j'informe en même temps, par la même occasion, que c'est la liste qui sera clôturée ainsi. Merci beaucoup. Le Cuba, vous avez la parole.
Muchas gracias, copresidente. También hacer extensiva las gracias a los grupos de evaluación por la información que nos aportaron. Me voy a referir a uno de las últimas presentaciones que sobre el reporte cuatrienal, donde, y cito, la enmienda de Kigali trae retos a las partes, especialmente a las partes del artículo 5. Nos gustaría, las dos preguntas que tenemos previstas es, primero, nos gustaría saber si existe algún estudio ya con argumentos, con detalles que demuestren que existe una posibilidad de no cumplir con la enmienda de Kigali en el largo plazo, antes de, o sea, en los próximos 5 años. Y segundo, si existen alternativas para poder dar respuesta a este reto que se plantea. Es evidente que el tema lo está pivotando seriamente sobre la posibilidad de cumplir con la enmienda de Kigali. Y lo hemos visto ahora en el Fondo Multilateral, los fondos se están restringiendo con relación a etapas anteriores. Además, es una etapa pospandémica. Muchas gracias.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué du Cuba. Nous avons accueilli l'Égypte, le Canada, Chili et le Cuba. Donc, à présent, nous allons laisser la parole aux experts chevronnés dans le domaine pour qu'ils puissent nous aider à apporter des éléments d'éclaircissement sur ces questions qui sont posées. Honorable délégué, je vous laisse la parole. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît. Je vois, on soulève votre... Allez-y, allez-y.
The question from Kenya and Mozambique as to why women are experiencing high cancer incidences in comparison to men. But it is actually the other way around, and I would like to refer you to page 12 of our quadrennial assessment, and that shows two separate bar diagrams. The diagram that I showed you in the presentation was only given for men, and it had an arrow for women at an incidence rate at 30 per 100,000, whereas the maximum for men was over 40 per 100,000. And I think some of the confusion may have come that I did not show both bargrams at the same time. So the bar diagram on the left on page 12 shows the incidence for men, and on the right, the incidence for women. And if you disregard the incidence for Australia and New Zealand, the incidence rate for both men and women are very similar. But to go perhaps a little further, for Australia and New Zealand, for both men and women, they are exposed to high amounts of UV radiation, which we typically have, especially in summer. And I do still agree that 30 out of 100,000 for women is still high, but both men and women spend quite a lot of time outdoors, and men have more jobs that expose them for longer periods outdoors than women. But if you are referring to Kenya and Mozambique, we don't have specific information on those particular countries, and that would depend very much on the activities of men and women, and also probably on skin cancer incidences on people with darker skins or lighter skins, because in Australia and New Zealand, most of the population is of a lighter skin, and the darker skins have much better protection against cancer incidences than the lighter ones, as you would expect. I hope I've answered your questions. If not, please come and see me afterwards. Thank you.
This is the TEEP, the MC talk, responding to the questions from the delegate from Canada relating to the chemical pathways in HFC 23. The delegate asked whether the report on 34/7 that will be presented to the MOP will report on any additional pathways. The answer to that is that all the main pathways have been outlined in our assessment report, and also, I might add, in the progress report in response to the other chemical pathways decision. But there are other sources that we need to include in doing an overall look at HFC 23, and that includes some emissive uses, for example. So that report will pull together all of the information that we've already published on those main pathways. It will include information on the other emissive sources, and try and better quantify those emission sources, all of those emission sources. And finally, there was a question about whether the new information that's already been presented on chemical pathways could explain the discrepancy between the top-down atmospheric observations of HFC 23. I guess my answer to that would be, at the moment, we have more work to do, and that will be presented in our report to the MOP. But I would also as a free advertisement for a side event that will be held on Wednesday, kind of encourage parties to attend a side event that's being organised by the SAP and the TEEP that will provide current information on this topic of HFC 23 emissions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. In response to the question from Canada on the Halon 1301 run-out date and the large 19-year window that we've provided, the uncertainties really come from two different areas. And the first is the reason every time we do this analysis, it comes earlier, is we're seeing more and more halon being tied up in what we have called enduring uses. So we're seeing, for example, in military, there are life extensions of these legacy systems so that these systems are going to be in existence for a longer period of time than originally anticipated. Same for nuclear power plants. We're seeing relicensing of these plants for longer periods of time going forward into the future. Oil and gas in a similar way. So if we could get better information on how much is really tied up in these existing systems that are going to be enduring, and a better understanding of what we think in the future these systems are going to be, continuing for, that would be helpful in reducing the uncertainty. Another area is how much halon is coming out of the non-enduring uses. For example, shipbreaking. We are getting estimates over the last couple of years from one particular country with a series of shipyards, and we are seeing significantly less halon coming out from shipbreaking than we would have projected. We're not sure if that's real in terms of the halon is no longer in the ships that are being broken. In other words, they've hit their end of life and the halon is no longer there, or if it's being diverted earlier in the shipbreaking process. We are trying to get that information, but if we could get clarity on that, that would help reduce uncertainty. Lastly, as was discussed actually yesterday at the workshop, we are seeing halon emission estimates based on atmospheric abundances greater than we would expect from the FSTOC models based on sort of bottom-up approach. And we think it's possible that that is not coming from the Fire Protection Bank and is actually coming from feedstock production and use, but we don't have enough visibility into what the actual feedstock production and use emissions are, and that would greatly reduce the uncertainty. It would certainly give us a much better idea if the estimates from the emission estimates from the FSTEC model are accurate or not. So those are the basic areas of uncertainty. If we could get more information on, would greatly help us to decrease that window from 19 years that we currently have. Thank you very much.
Okay. In replying to the question from Argentina and also Chile on the availability of supply of alternate foam blowing agents, several years ago, the FTOC reported on a lack of supply of foam blowing agents, not only HFOs, but also hydrocarbons, specifically cyclopentane, insufficient supply in order to meet demand. Several companies had reported to us that they could not get sufficient supply. In recent years, as additional capacity, in the past year, as the additional capacity has come online, those companies have come back and reported that the issues have eased some and that there is more supply available now than there was several years ago. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je pense que les experts nous ont vraiment appuyés et nous ont fourni suffisamment d'informations. À présent, je voudrais clore la session de questions-réponses à ce stade et remercier une fois de plus les groupes d'évaluation pour leur remarquable contribution. Il y a un point que le SAP voudrait préciser. Allez-y.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. There were a couple of questions, in particular, one from Egypt about the imbalance of the network distribution. And we in the science community completely agree with the delegate from Egypt. There is an imbalance. These are very technical stations to build, and in fact, we would love to increase the number of stations to cover various regions that are currently uncovered by stations. So thank you for that question, and we agree with you. There is an imbalance. There was a question from Canada about VSLS ODPs. ODPs for very short-lived substances are very difficult to calculate because they depend on where the substance is emitted. A substance that is emitted in the tropics can be convected up and get into the stratosphere easily. A short-lived species that is emitted in the mid-latitudes is less likely to make it out of the troposphere and into the stratosphere to cause ozone depletion. So ODPs depend on where they're emitted for very short-lived substances. So that means that there's not a single value that you can put into the table for an ODP. There's more or less a range of values, and it really depends on the distribution of emissions to calculate what ozone depletion is. And in fact, there are a number of modeling studies that have done ozone depletion for very short-lived substances, but again, it depends where they're emitted. So thank you for that question. I hope that clarifies that. There was another question about carbon tetrachloride, and in fact, the emissions estimate has changed because the lifetime changed. And the lifetime is calculated from photolysis in the stratosphere, that is, UV radiation breaks down carbon tetrachloride, but there's also ocean loss of carbon tetrachloride, and that is a very complex estimate to make. What is the global ocean loss of carbon tetrachloride? It is a fairly long lifetime, but nevertheless it adds to the carbon tetrachloride lifetime, and that is a difficult calculation because of the complexity of ocean loss processes. So in fact, yes, the lifetime has changed because the ocean lifetime changed, not because the stratospheric lifetime changed. Just a final point, there is an overlap at the edges of the top-down and bottom-up emissions. That doesn't mean they're exactly consistent. There's still an offset, but they overlap at their edges. So we've made great improvements in solving the budget of carbon tetrachloride in the last 20 years, and we hope that we can make more progress on that. So I hope that answers the two questions from Canada. David?
Yes, and to return to the delegate from Egypt, we appreciate the comment that the 20 questions and answers as presented this morning is praiseworthy. And then the question was the possibility of translation. In the past, there's been some effort to translate the earlier versions. As leading that effort, I would highly welcome that and would look to the Secretariat perhaps to guide us on possibilities for that. And then simply to warn that it's a real challenge to craft the language and capture all of the nuance. Certainly we work very, very diligently in English to achieve what we have achieved. So we would want to identify those who can really speak carefully to the scientific language in other languages. So thank you for that suggestion, and we stand by to help that process if it were to start.
Demande de parole, je pense que c'est le EAP. Allez-y. Oui, allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
It's a very quick clarification for Mozambique and Kenya for the incidences in men and women. It's, I'd like to just correct the page number there. It's 127 and not page 12 that you need to look at. So page 127. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Nous avons fait le tour des questions. Et il faut noter aussi qu'il y a aussi des observations qui ont été faites, qui sont adressées au Fonds multilatéral, notamment par rapport à certaines interventions pour des subventions pour aller à la traduction du livre 20 questions, 20 réponses, par exemple, en arabique. Donc, tous ces éléments sont entendus et le secrétariat va travailler par rapport à cela. Donc, comme je le disais tantôt, je voudrais clore la session de questions et de réponses. Et à ce stade, nous remercions encore une fois les experts des groupes d'évaluation pour leur remarquable intervention et contribution. Nous allons à présent les laisser pour se tourner vers la suite de l'agenda. Toutefois, les experts, soyez vigilants. Nous pourrons toujours revenir à vous au besoin pour des éclaircissements sur certaines questions. Je vous remercie. Les délégués voudront peut-être faire des déclarations et des interventions d'ordre général. Nous allons maintenant laisser la parole au co-chair pour poursuivre le travail. Oui, c'est par rapport aux déclarations. Comme je le disais tantôt, est-ce qu'il y a des déclarations? S'il y a des déclarations, nous allons accueillir les déclarations. La séance est ouverte pour les déclarations. Merci. Apparemment, il n'y a pas de déclaration. Ah, il y a des manifestations. Donc, allez-y rapidement, soyez bref et concis. Il y a le Myanmar. Le Myanmar, vous avez la parole pour faire votre déclaration.
Thank you, Chair, for accepting our request for floor in Thailand for warm hospitality and ozone security for organizing such important meeting. First, I'm pleased to inform that the ozone security that we were trying to submit our HFC and methane bromide data by following the MOB 34 decisions, particularly 10, 13 and 22, but we are still trying to complete it due to data requirement and our technical capacity. And in the context of HFC, we are encouraging all the stakeholders to use HFC and HFC use cooling technologies and requirements. Meanwhile, we remind them to be careful while importing and purchasing HFC and HFC use equipment, as HFC phasing down plan is to be started from 2029 due to preparing to ratify Kigali Amendment. Yes. And regarding the methyl bromide, we are strictly using it only in QPS by well, we are suffering from economic benefits reduction as the current situation. And currently, methyl bromide amount of 50 tons per year, and we are trying to reduce, but illegal use of methyl bromide was not observed. In this case, we are trying to calculate our methyl bromide potential requirement based on crop production rates. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué du Myanmar. Maintenant, je donne la parole au Norway. Merci.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We would like to thank the Kingdom of Thailand for their hospitality, and we also thank the Ozone Secretariat and its staff for all the preparation and organization of this meeting. We appreciate the great work of the panels, and we thank them for all the reports, and we recognize that it must have been a challenge in information and reports. Regarding the SAP report, the take-home message that we believe parties need to take into consideration is that early and faster action transitioning away from controlled substances can hasten the recovery of the ozone layer, as well as give significant benefits by limiting global warming. We would like to express our concerns about unexplained high levels of atmospheric concentration of several controlled substances, and more particularly the great contribution from the growth in the volumes of controlled substances for feedstock uses, and associated emissions of byproducts such as HFC-23. We are also concerned about the fact that these emissions and other emissions of controlled substances are unexplained due to limitations in the global monitoring networks. We look forward to discussing improvement of monitoring under later agenda items, as monitoring of ODS, HFCs, ozone layer, and UV radiation will stay relevant for decades to come. Turning to another matter that has been addressed by the EAP, we thank them for the thorough literature review and assessment of TFA, that is a breakdown product from several HFCs, HFOs, and other alternatives to controlled substances under the Montreal Protocol. However, we think it would have been useful to highlight in the report other approaches for performing risk assessments. Under the chemicals regulation in Europe, we look at TFE from a different perspective than the classical risk assessment. Because this is a substance that is so persistent in the environment, we are of the view that one cannot conclude on the potential effects from long-term exposure to low concentration. Such substances are therefore assessed as non-threshold substances, and releases of those substances into the environment should be minimized at the extent possible. There is mounting evidence from recent studies that large amounts of TFA are released into the environment by various anthropogenic sources, including from the use of HFCs and HFOs, and that the concentrations of TFA in fresh waters, drinking water, as well in tree leaves, have considerably increased over the last decades. This should be a matter of great concern. Broadening the matter to PFAS in general, we have strong concerns about the increasing use of various PFAS substances, many of them being introduced as alternatives to controlled substances under this body. We note that while the Montreal Protocol has been effective in protecting the ozone layer, we have not yet succeeded in avoiding other environmental and climate effects caused by the several transitions away from controlled substances. We think that it is timely that we as parties should take into consideration all potential consequences for climate and environment when assessing which alternatives are available to transition away from controlled substances. Thank you, Chair. Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Honoré. Effectivement, la question des TIFAS, ça c'est une question qui émerge et nous pensons peut-être qu'on puisse regarder davantage par rapport à ça, faire le suivi, poursuivre les études par rapport à la survenue, à la présence de ces substances-là dans l'environnement. Mais également, il y a un autre produit aussi qui devient préoccupant. Il s'agit des HFC, du HFC 23, qui aussi est préoccupant. Donc, tous ces produits, on n'oublie pas les autres produits. Hein. Il y a aussi le bromide de méthyle qui est là, qui est toujours préoccupant. Mais ces produits qui sont retrouvés dans l'environnement et qui perturbent l'environnement et la santé, nous pensons qu'il faut qu'on poursuive les études afin de mieux appréhender le contexte de leur nocivité sur la santé et sur l'environnement. À présent, je vais donner la parole à l'Australie pour sa déclaration.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and good evening, everyone. Firstly, we'd like to place on record our sincere thanks and deep gratitude to the panels for their work over the last few years. We recognise it has been a very tough time in which to undertake global cooperative work thanks to the COVID-19 restrictions, and their work would have been additionally challenging as a result of those restrictions and working virtually. We would like to note that we could not do our work without the panels doing their work, so great gratitude to them. Just briefly, we would like to indicate, I think the panel presentations have given us some good news, and I think there is good news in the presentations that have been provided. The evidence for ozone recovery is there. The unexpected increase in CFC 11 emissions has been arrested. And the Montreal Protocol is doing its job in safeguarding the planet from significantly increased UV radiation. So we think there is definitely some good news from the panels that we can take away from their presentations and from their reports. However, there are still some uncertainties and concerns. A number of delegates have mentioned the rise in HFC 23 emissions, and we see this item has been put on the agenda for our discussion later under agenda item 3G, so we look forward to having that discussion then. The use and production of controlled chemicals like CTC and HCFC 22 for feedstock uses appears to be resulting in increased emissions of controlled substances. And we have put on the agenda that we would also like to discuss that particular issue under agenda item 3G. We did note the rise in concentration of minor CFC species and the lack of reduction of CTC in the atmosphere, the emissions of very short-lived substances like DC dichloromethane, which has also been put on the agenda. One of the issues we would particularly like to raise, though, is that the future of ozone levels depends in part not on issues related to ozone depleting substances or their concentrations, but on issues such as increased water, hydrogen, methane or NOx being emitted to the atmosphere through new aircraft fleets, rockets, volcanic eruptions as we've heard, or through intentional injection of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to reduce climate warming. On this particular issue, we appreciated the update provided by the Scientific Assessment Panel in its assessment. We also note that UNEP released a report in February this year called One Atmosphere that actually undertook a review of the state of research on solar radiation management. Having reviewed these reports together, we are wondering whether the effects of solar radiation management on ozone layer recovery is not well understood nor being considered in the limited science that is being undertaken. And we think this is a cause of concern, given the potential for solar radiation management or stratospheric aerosol injection activities to affect the ozone layer negatively, and immediately, as we've just heard from the Scientific Assessment Panel, and for these activities to perhaps affect the work that we have been doing for more than 30 years now. So with this in mind, Australia is considering a possible decision which we would like to submit to the parties later in this week, just to alert the global scientific community in particular about the need to factor in the effects on the ozone layer of any solar radiation management research undertaken. So I think that's all we'd like to say. We're conscious that we are over time and would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to make this brief statement. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué de l'Australie. Il y a plusieurs points qui ont été énumérés et chacun de ces points sont très, très importants. Il y a des idées, il y a des réflexions qui sont en cours. Nous souhaiterions que ces réflexions-là puissent être mises sur un papier sous forme de document et que ça puisse être déposé au niveau du secrétariat afin que considération puisse être donnée pour la suite des activités. Donc, nous attendons donc ce document-là au niveau du secrétariat. Je voudrais, par la même occasion, remercier les délégués pour leur assiduité et attention qu'ils ont accordée à tous les travaux, aux différentes présentations, et aussi pour leur participation à la session de questions-réponses. Cette session nous a apporté beaucoup d'éléments d'éclaircissement. Les points qui ont été plus ou moins cernés à notre niveau, nous avons eu des éléments qui nous ont permis de mieux comprendre les choses. À présent, nous allons lever la séance parce que la session de questions-réponses a dépassé nos prévisions. Donc, nous allons réaménager les choses et au niveau du secrétariat, nous allons réaménager les choses pour que demain matin, on puisse répondre et reprendre dans de bonnes conditions en forme et poursuivre nos travaux. Je vous remercie et bonne soirée. N'oubliez pas de jeter des coups d'œil à l'écran pour prendre l'actualité en cours, voir l'évolution de nos réunions et aussi les informations concernant les activités parallèles, je veux dire les side events. Merci beaucoup et bonne soirée.